Page 1, we're going to start, as we talked about, with the regulatory system. And just a word so that we're all on the same page about what we mean with the regulatory system. Just as an example, we have in the environmental realm, we have like federal laws like the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act. We have equivalents at the state level. We have the Endangered Species Act. We have in the labor realm, the National Labor Relations Act. Those all are laws. Statutes adopted by Congress, and then in order to implement those laws, they create all of these rules and regulations in order to implement them, that operationalize those laws. So when we're talking about the regulatory system, we're talking about, like we can talk about the Clean Water Act, the actual statute itself and the regulations that they put into place to operationalize that thing. And that's what we mean collectively when we talk about the regulatory system. And we'll talk about the environmental, we'll talk about the labor, there's more, but that's what we're primarily going to focus on this evening. But just to give you that sense. So we're going to begin on page 1. This is a piece from the Roanoke Times back in 1997. It's a piece that I think, well, you may not have seen this one, of course. You'll probably see pretty similar pieces like this in whatever your local newspaper is. It says at the top, Smithfield says state miscounted the extent of its water pollution. We're going to read a little bit and then dissect it a bit. In the left-hand column, the first paragraph, it says Isle of Wight. Smithfield Foods, Inc., one of the largest pork processors on the East Coast, has violated state water permits 22,520 times over the past decade, state attorneys alleged in court on Monday. Skipping to the third paragraph in that column, about halfway through that paragraph, talking about what they are alleged to have done. Some were for the alleged release of excessive amounts of chlorine, fecal coliform bacteria, nitrogen, and other pollutants into the Pagan River, a Chesapeake Bay tributary. What does that mean? What are they saying there in that paragraph?
They're poisoning the place.
Yes, Stoney, they're poisoning the place. The word that I like to focus on there is the word excessive. So
not excessive is okay.
Right, exactly. So let's say that a little louder.
That not excessive is okay.
Right. So some amount of this stuff being dumped is okay. They are being alleged for having gone above whatever that threshold might be. Just to give you a sense of that regulatory system actually allows pollution to take place. It regulates how much pollution, how frequently we can dump, how much we can put into the air and so forth. It allows that pollution, and these folks apparently did something over and above whatever that threshold might be. Moving to the last paragraph on the right-hand column, let's see what the attorney for Smithfield Foods has to say about these allegations. That first full paragraph, Anthony Troy, an attorney for Smithfield Foods, said the company acknowledges some violations. Quote, we think a penalty should be paid, but we do not think we had a $4 million to $7 million savings from the violations, as their experts will put on, Mr. Troy said. So what did the state have to say? Middle paragraph, middle column at the very top. We hear from someone named Butcher. That's the Assistant Attorney General Butcher. He did not specify how much the state wants Smithfield to be fined, but he asked the judge to consider the seriousness of the violations and whether Smithfield had benefited from them. So what's happening there? We have the attorney for the corporation and then the attorney for the state. What are they saying?
Putting a price tag on the poison.
Yeah, putting a price tag on the poison. I'm sorry, what did you say, David?
I think they're striking the deal.
Yeah. Yeah, so they're having a monetary conversation, and what's left out of that conversation?
The damage that was done.
Yeah, the damage that was done to the environment. Where is the environment in all of this? They're negotiating what the corporation is going to have to pay. There seems to be little connection between what they actually have to pay and actually the kind of damage that gets done. And in fact, that is absolutely correct because...
Or what happens moving forward.
Or what happens moving forward. Very good point, too. Because the way that damages are assessed against corporations for these kind of violations, and we see these kinds of articles a lot, right? And then we see EPA assess such and such amount. That amount is a negotiated amount. It has nothing to do with what's actually going to fix that damage that occurred to the environment or the ecosystem like you described. It has nothing to do. Those numbers have nothing to do with what happened to the ecosystem itself. So that's the kind of conversation that we're having. Okay, let's move on to finish this out. In the middle column, at the very bottom, the very last paragraph, begins, Rettig ran the company's wastewater operations. This fellow named Terry Rettig. He ran the company's wastewater operations at 2 packing plants until August 1994. He was sentenced in January to 30 months in prison after admitting destroying and falsifying documents. Okay, so he worked for Smithfield, he falsified documents, so forth and so on. Old story, he's in prison. Then these new allegations come forward, and we see, if we go to the right-hand column, that there's concern because, as we see, let's see, 1, 2, 3, the 4th paragraph down in the right-hand column says, when Rettig. When Rettig, who was brought from a federal prison in Petersburg, took the stand, he said his lawyer had advised him not to answer most questions to avoid possible civil liability. What happened? What was Mr. Rettig doing? He pled the 5th. That's right, he pled the 5th Amendment, right? Can't incriminate himself, right? Okay, so we're all familiar with that from our Law and Order watching, which we don't admit to. Next paragraph, so what happens? Okay, so he's saying, I'm not going to testify, all right? So then the judge, named Tribune, barred the state from using as evidence a deposition that Mr. Rettig started to give federal authorities in a separate lawsuit before he stopped answering questions. So there was other testimony that went on before he pled the 5th. Smithfield Foods lawyers argued it would be unfair to use that deposition because they could not get to cross-examine Rettig about his answers. So he did a little bit of testimony, Mr. Rettig did, but then because he was pleading the 5th and wasn't going to talk anymore, then Smithfield's lawyers didn't have the chance to ask him questions or depose him or anything. What was the corporation then doing? Anyone?
They were dumping all the blame on one person. They were individualizing it to one person.
That's true.
And they were stopping the process from moving forward.
Yeah, right. So they're protecting themselves from Mr. Rettig's testimony, whatever that testimony, I don't know what it said, but one way or another, they needed to stop that, right? And so we have Mr. Rettig on the one hand pleading the 5th to protect himself, then you have the corporation pleading the 6th. And the 6th is when you have the right to confront your accusers. It's one of the Bill of Rights. I have the right to confront my accuser, I'm a natural person, I get that. Corporations also have that right. Mr. Rettig pleads the 5th, corporations plead the 6th, and they get to protect themselves from whatever he said in that deposition, whatever his testimony is. We use this article because, as I said, there's many like it, but there's so much happening here. And one of the things that we don't ever, it's so rare that we see this in a news article, they don't tell us about the 5th Amendment in here. They don't tell us about the 6th Amendment in here. We don't know all that's going on. We don't know that the damages aren't really going to pay for the ecosystem's harm. We don't know any of that stuff. It doesn't come out in these kinds of articles. And unless you have some sort of depth of knowledge about it and can read between the lines, it gets all kind of covered up. And our culture, through through news media in any case, has a tendency to sort of make this seem very normal. It makes it seem very normal, and we don't really understand exactly what's going on and what the harm is that really happened there. We use this too just to give a sort of illustration of what the regulatory system looks like. States issued permits to the Smithfield Corporation to conduct their activities. That's the permitting system under the regulatory system. It seems like, as Elizabeth said, that those permits are used to actually conduct some sort of pollution. And in this case, as many corporations do, they went above and beyond whatever those pollution thresholds are. That seems to be, 22,000 plus times, seems to be standard operating procedure for this company. And so the question of culture, I think, is actually really interesting. And this is a fairly new curriculum. We didn't used to have this discussion of culture so pointedly. I'm glad that we do now, because I think it's a very big tool that's wielded against us. In the next two pieces, we look at a fellow named Edward Bernays. Born in 1891, he's considered one of the fathers of public relations. If you'll turn with me to page 13. We find out that he's actually the nephew of Sigmund Freud. And he was one of, following, I guess, in Freud's footsteps, one of the first to use and manipulate public opinion by using psychology. And as we see on page 13, that second paragraph, the folks with Wikipedia tell us, he felt this manipulation was necessary in society, which he regarded as irrational and dangerous as a result of the herd instinct. So he considered the masses, society, to be irrational and dangerous. We'll get a little bit more of a feel for that. One of the techniques that he employed was this use of third-party authorities. I don't know about you, but in my own activism, I know we are always looking for third parties like nurses and teachers, people that people trust. He did this a lot, and he really perfected it. Turning to page 14, if we turn the page, we'll see some of the campaigns that Mr. Bernays worked on. We'll see at the very top, that very first bullet on 14, Bernays used his uncle Sigmund Freud's ideas to help convince the public, among other things, that bacon and eggs were the true all-American breakfast. And he was helping to promote bacon sales. And so he went to doctors, to physicians, to get them to say, yes, indeed, bacon and eggs is the way to go. And so he used doctors as third-party experts to help promote bacon across the country very successfully. Skipping a bullet, the third bullet, we find out that Bernays helped the Aluminum Company of America, Alcoa, as we know it now, and other special interest groups to convince the American public that water fluoridation was safe and beneficial to human health. This was achieved by using the American Dental Association in a highly successful media campaign. The next bullet, too, I like, in which they say that in the 30s, his Dixie Cup campaign was designed to convince consumers that only disposable cups were sanitary. So he used all sorts of different techniques in order to move his interests forward, and his interests were those of his clients, Dixie Cup, bacon, and so on. He also used his techniques of public relations, manipulating psychology, and so on. As we see under the headline of overthrowing the government of Guatemala, he assisted the United Food Company, which we now know as Chiquita, and the U.S. government to overthrow the democratically elected president of Guatemala. He helped brand the president as a communist and facilitated corporate domination of the government in order to facilitate the banana trade, the banana industry, and in fact used slave-like labor for banana production and used culture, used PR in order to do that. So he wielded a very strong, very big stick in his technique, and we see how that PR techniques that he developed, we see all over the place in our world today.
Is that a bananas talk there, or was he just glad to see us?
That was his, yeah. We'll just get a little sense of his writing, because he did write quite a bit as well. If we turn back to page 10, he wrote a book published in 1928 called Propaganda. On page 10, starting with, it's chapter 1. Chapter 1 is called Organizing Chaos. That very first paragraph on page 10, the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we never heard of.
And isn't that the essence of democracy?
Indeed. And so that was Mr. Bernays. That was his philosophy, that we needed to have our minds molded, our ideas manipulated, and that to him was really what was necessary in order to control the masses. His work laid the groundwork for so much of the culture that we experience today, and really the colonization of us today through that culture and thinking that we have. And we're going to give you a modern day example of what we mean when we say that, of how corporations working with government use these kinds of techniques to affect not only how we think in terms of our culture, but also affecting our activism. And we're going to turn to Thomas on that one to look at sewage sludge.
And even as something as simple as the language that we use to describe certain things. On page 15, you have a piece called A Rose by Any Other Name. The piece deals with something called sewage sludge. For folks, it's probably good we're after dinner, not before, but for folks that don't know what sewage sludge is, it's all the stuff that goes down the drain or down the toilet in an area that's hooked up to a centralized sewage treatment plant, also known as a POTW. The POTW, when they take the material in, separate out the liquid and the solid. They call the solid sludge cake, which goes to show that you can't put cake after everything and make it sound that much better. But you got sludge cake, and then you got the liquid component. Liquid component is generally discharged into a tributary or a waterway. The sludge cake is packaged up and then sent away to a farm, generally, for land application of that sewage sludge to the land. We used to dump sludge off the coast of New Jersey. That's how we dealt with sludge. What's in the stuff? Well, it can contain up to 100,000 different toxic components, toxic contaminants. The EPA requires testing for 9 of those 100,000 different toxic contaminants. When we dumped it in the ocean off the coast of New Jersey, what happened? Well, it killed most of the life off the coast of New Jersey, causing a dead zone. The environmental organizations got together with the Reagan administration and actually came up with something called the land application of sewage sludge. So what we once used to dump in the ocean, 60% of that sludge now produced by the POTWs is actually disposed of on land where crops are grown both for human consumption as well as for livestock consumption. That's how we deal with sludge today. Why is it bad besides the 100,000 different possible toxic contaminants in the waste stream? Well, there's two children that have died in New Hampshire after riding their ATVs through a sludged field. Staphylococcus aureus infections that came because the cheapest way to treat the sludge is to mix it with lime. The lime can become airborne, which attaches the virus and other bacteria. So you actually breathe it in, especially if you're immunocompromised, you're young, or you're a senior citizen. We've had 2 children die in Pennsylvania. We actually represented one of the 2 of the parents whose son died after coming into contact with sewage sludge. Sewage sludge is just a nasty little phrase. When you hear it, you just want to turn away from it. The industry has known that for a number of years, and working with the Environmental Protection Agency, I am happy to announce that in Pennsylvania, we don't have sewage sludge anymore. We have something called biosolids, which is the name that the industry working with the Environmental Protection Agency has developed to actually refer to sewage sludge as biosolids. And who could be against biosolids recycling? Because of course it's being recycled on the land and it's biosolids, and anything with bio in it sounds decent. So this piece on page 15 actually tells the story. I'm not going to go through it except to point out 2 things, but is the story about how the EPA hired a group called the Water Environment Federation, WEF. WEF is the lobbying arm of the sewage treatment works in the United States, to come up with this phrase, biosolids. And you'll see 3 paragraphs down at the end. They actually had a lot of suggestions come in from their member groups, including all growth, pure nutri, BioLife, BioSlurp, Black Gold, Geoslime, Skidoo, Humanure, organic residuals, bioresidue. Anyway, you get the picture. And eventually they settled on biosolids. And what's fascinating to me is that as the activist community, a lot of activists actually use the industry term when they do their work. And so we'll run into folks in communities who are saying, well, it's biosolids. Well, that's a carefully calculated way of changing the language so that people are no longer using sewage sludge, but are using that term biosolids. So that's how biosolids came about. The next article that you have, page 17, talks about these factory farm operations. And we include 2 pieces from Pew, the Pew Charitable Trust, just as a way of encapsulating and framing what the real problem is with factory farms. It's not, at least in our opinion, the opinion of Pew and others, it's not just the odor, it's not just the water pollution, it's actually that we're undergoing something called the corporatization of agriculture, in which a very small number of corporations is increasingly controlling a larger percentage of the food that we eat. So for example, I threw out this statistic before, but 4 corporations control 65% of the pork that's raised in the United States today. 4 corporations control 70% of chicken production in the United States today. 1 corporation, Kraft, controls 60% of all cheese production in the United States today. So what we're looking at is an increasing corporate concentration over food retailing, over growing, over general production. It's a vertically integrated production system these corporations are putting together. Pew puts it in other language on page 17, that full paragraph that you see under the heading, 4 lines down. They talk about concern that any deal that lessens or increases corporate consolidation in the field could not only reduce competition in the livestock market, but also increase prices for consumers. Many experts claim the consolidation of the nation's animal agriculture has led to a more concentrated, industrialized model, which has had dramatic and increasingly problematic impacts on rural communities and the traditional farm. Further down, they write, especially in the case of poultry and swine, a small number of corporations produce, process, and sell the majority of America's food animal products. Last sentence, while profitable for the corporations, this vertically integrated structure makes it difficult for small non-contract farms to compete and perpetuates a system of intensive animal production that can pose harmful effects to human health and the environment. I think that's pretty well said. Page 19, you'll see the actual study that they put out that the first piece of the press release for. Page 20, first full paragraph in the middle of the page. They write, over the past 50 years, the production of farm animals for food has shifted from the traditional, extensive, decentralized family farm system to a more concentrated system with fewer producers, in which large numbers of animals are confined in enormous operations. Very last sentence on that page 20, that the system as it exists today too often concentrates economic power in the hands of large companies that process and sell the animal products. Now, you would think that factory farms that we generally would assign negative values to is a phrase that other folks would want to change too. Just like the industry dealing with sewage sludge had to change it to biosolids, turns out that the factory farm industry and the agribusiness boys have also come up with a new term. So I'm happy to announce that in Pennsylvania we no longer have factory farms, we have advanced and modern farms. That's the phrase that's used in the industry now.
I think you may be referring to something known as NLP, Neuro-Linguistic Programming.
Mm-hmm. That's, yes, it's the way of changing language so that we change the way that we conceptualize these ideas. Yes. And so what you'll see on page 23 is a release put out by a group called PenAg Industries, which is the main factory farm voice for agribusiness corporations in the state of Pennsylvania. And you'll see on page 23, 4 paragraphs down, starting with advanced farms. You'll see the sentence, advanced farms located all across Pennsylvania are more efficient. Advanced farms are more efficient. They raise livestock or crops by using advanced techniques in feeding, livestock, health management, predator and pest control, nutrient management, and other processes that produce quality food as safely and efficiently as possible. Yes. So that's the way that the concept has been reconceptualized for us. Just like sewage sludge to biosolids, we now have factory farms to advanced or modern farms. And of course, that language puts us as community activists and folks assisting that process on their back feet. Because who would be against advanced and modern farms? Who are you to tell farmers that they can't use the latest in technology? Who are you to keep farmers in the dark ages and stop this process from continuing forward? So the language is very specifically calculated to, in essence, ensure our loss at the community level before we even do the work, because the language has been changed. And even we have factory farm activists in communities who actually use the phrase that's been drummed up by industry to use, which of course is idiocy, because then you're censoring yourself one step back from the community activism. Elizabeth.
So how can they actually say that produce quality food as safely as possible?
Yeah.
Well, I don't understand what that means, whether it's the food you eat is safe or...
Well, what they mean is that the new process, which is this modernization of the system, and so if you go to a factory farm, the ones that they show people at least are the ones with the white outfits and they're sterile, and you walk in and they have the assembly line feed systems that are operating for the hogs. It's a very efficient process. That's how they try to sell it, and it's very safe. They don't tell you, of course, that they have to ramp up the animals with all kinds of hormones and antibiotics so they can be raised in that system. But this is the line, and it's not just the agribusiness industry's line, it's Penn State Agriculture Department and the universities that come together to actually assist those agribusiness producers to carry out that trademarking. So we've been looking at how the regulatory system operates. We're going to wrap that up and bring it all together with a triangle about how the regulatory system operates. But suffice it to say that the regulatory system doesn't just operate in the law, it actually operates in our heads as a cultural shift kind of thing that has to take place. And Marty's going to take us through the triangle on page 25.
So we've been talking a bit about factory farms, and we're going to use that as our example for what we call the regulatory triangle. You have it on 25, and I'm going to draw it up here too, and I want to make sure everybody can see. Jeff's not paying attention, so he doesn't ruin it. Okay, this is what you have. This is what we're going to do up here too. So we've been talking about factory farms. And there's so many reasons why. When a community finds out that they're facing a factory farm coming in, and sometimes it's not just one, sometimes it's like 10 that are being planned for their community. And there's many, many, many reasons why a community doesn't want them. What are the we've been talking about them. What have you heard? What do you know? Yeah, you don't want the sludge that comes with it. And the sludge equals toxins. What else? Why we might not want something like this coming into our community? Smell? Yeah.
Property values.
Yes, property values. It's a big one.
Water contamination.
What was that?
Water contamination.
Yep. Water and other environmental contamination.
Liability without pigs farms.
Trucking and transport.
Yeah, there's all sorts of traffic stuff that happens. Somebody said wiping out small farmers. We see a lot of that. We're still seeing it. Hundreds of thousands of small and independent family farmers have gone out of business since the agribusiness corporations have come in and started putting factory farms in place all over the country. So there's a wide number of reasons, and I'm sure there are more, and we could continue to list them. But in essence, when you find out that a factory farm comes to town, the community could have one, two, multiple reasons why they don't want this thing to come in. And so the community defines the problem of the factory farm very broadly, right? I mean, there's many, many, many things that prevent them from wanting this to come in. They define this problem broadly. It's environmental, it's economic, it's agriculture. You know, we mentioned the food systems itself. We don't even know where our food comes from anymore. It's right up food. The impact that it has on our local economies. If we're a rural agrarian community, we've seen these communities get wiped out. We've certainly seen them in Pennsylvania and across the country. These communities get decimated when a factory farm comes to town. So there's a wide range of things that people don't want a factory farm, and we call this basically a broad problem statement for our purposes here. Now I'm going to force you. So this is the community's broad problem statement, all encapsulated in here and probably more reasons. I'm going to force you to think back about an hour or so when we first started talking about the work that we started to do in Pennsylvania when communities, hundreds of them, were facing factory farms coming in. And you'll remember that Thomas mentioned something called the Nutrient Management Act. That was a law put into place at the behest of agribusiness corporations because, as we know, when you have 10,000, 100,000 hogs in a place, they're going to have a lot of shit. And what to do with that manure is what the Nutrient Management Act was put in place to deal with. As Thomas described, it's a planning law. So if you want to put a factory farm in place, you have to apply to for a permit from the state in which you outline where you're going to put that liquid manure and how much of it you're going to put down on the ground. It's a planning law. Tell us how you plan to deal with this manure. So what the state has done has determined that the problem is manure. The community has determined it's this. The state has determined it's manure. And the way that we're going to solve this manure problem is through the Nutrient Management Act. So they passed this law. They put in place regulations to implement that law. And they define it very, very narrowly. This is the problem, manure. The solution, the Nutrient Management Act. Very different from the community. The state drives the community down to what we call a regulatory point. That regulatory point is such that for all of these many reasons that the community does not want a factory farm, the only thing they're allowed to talk about when they want to get active on this thing, if they want to appeal those permits, if they want to go to the hearings, if they want to get involved in trying to stop this thing from coming into their community, none of this stuff counts. None of it counts anymore. All that counts is manure. And they get to talk about manure, and they can bring in their manure experts, and the state will have their manure experts, and the corporation will have their manure expert, and they all get to talk about manure. But none of this stuff gets talked about. It doesn't matter what the smell is. It doesn't matter the environmental consequences. It doesn't matter that suicide is the #1 cause of death for farmers now. None of that matters. All that matters is manure. So the state defined this problem very narrowly as manure, and they passed something called the Nutrient Management Act. But they didn't do it alone. They had help because the agribusiness corporations helped them write that law. So the corporations also define the problem very narrowly because if you have a narrow problem, then you can have a very narrow solution in the Nutrient Management Act. And as Thomas has been talking to us about in terms of the culture also drives us down there. If you look at news reports of this kind of a fight, In terms of factory farms, all that you're going to see in the news reports, not any of this stuff. It's all about, well, what happened in that Nutrient Management Act hearing when they were appealing that permit. We can run any number of problems through what we call this regulatory triangle. And we see all this happening the same. The community gets driven down like cattle down a chute. And at the end of that chute, we know what happens. We get a bullet in the brain. In this case, these communities are driven down to this very narrow regulatory point. At which point, what happens? They get the factory farm. Because they're not allowed to say no. Because the regulatory system, what it does, it establishes this permitting program that the corporations apply to the state under the Nutrient Management Act. Here's our plan for dealing with the manure. And once they have that plan in place, that's it. It's done. None of this other stuff matters. The factory farm gets cited. The community has no role. They can go and testify, but if they start talking about the fact that we're worried about our water, or we're worried about our air, or we're worried about the traffic, they're told to sit, shut up and sit down. Because we're not talking about that now. We're talking, if you have something to say about manure, fine. We can talk about that, but that's it. And so the worst part about this is we've got the state, we've got the corporations and culture all in league together to drive us to this point in which we can't say no to factory farms and, in fact, to put factory farms in our community. The worst part about it is we did this work too. We did this work too. We also drove communities to that place. This was us. For a number of years, our organization also did this. And we know that other quote-unquote environmental organizations are also doing it. And what we mean is that when a community came to us and said, hey, we want to stop a factory farm from coming in, we said, oh, all right, well, there's a Nutrient Management Act, and there's a permitting system, and you get to talk about manure, and if you want to do this, we will help you to appeal that permit. So we drove them down to this point, too. We also defined this very broad problem very narrowly because the state did it for us.
So why didn't you raise the broader issue of repealing the Nutrient Management Act?
Well, and it's more than that, too. So we did this work for a number of years. And we figured out that we weren't helping communities to do anything. We certainly weren't stopping factory farms from being able to come in. And, and any number of environmental organizations rise up now, and the big ones too, help communities through this process, but all that happens is it at best delays this thing from coming in. Ultimately, the thing gets cited. So what did we do? What did we do? Well, figuring out that this doesn't work, this regulatory system, this is how it works. We could run other issues through the regulatory triangle. What I mean by that is, for example, if a community is facing a Walmart from coming in, and I know there's been any number of Walmart fights on the west side, just like there have been on the east side. And there's all, like any number of reasons why we don't want a Walmart, for example. Economic reasons, environmental reasons, so it's going to wipe out our downtown, local economy, and all of those many things. When a community finds out that a Walmart's coming to town, they have multiple concerns. But the state now defines that problem of Walmart from coming in. They define it very narrowly, and you'll find out that basically you're left to talk about traffic, setbacks, facades. That's all. It's the same idea. So the community's activism is focused on dealing with, they get traffic experts. They hold bake sales to pay traffic experts. That's what we end up doing. And it doesn't matter. I mean, in the sense that whatever it is, you could throw whatever environmental issue you want into this triangle, and the end result is the same.
Seattle's zoning process is very similar to that.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. It's not just the state, the localities also do it, and hand in hand. And so the problem is that you have all these forces sending the community down to something, a very narrowly defined problem, which means the solution that they find is very narrow, Nutrient Management Act or traffic or whatever it is, and their problem gets ignored. And the communities that we were working with, were asking us that big question of, well, why is it this way? Why is the system the way that it is? And that's when we took a big step back and looked at how does the system work. And our work now turns this thing upside down. Turns this upside down. Question?
Just observation, where we had fought an industrial gravel mine where I'm from, and what it ends up doing is it makes the company look like the good guy because they jump through all the hoops. And how could you be complaining? You keep complaining about this small, isolated group of people because they've done all things. It turns the credibility.
Yeah, I bet we all have stories about this, and we could run any number of issues through these triangles and find the same things happen, whether it's the gravel or Walmart or factory farm or what have you. This is how the system works. Obviously, it's simplified for our purposes here, but this is how the system works. And communities exhaust themselves through this system. Communities that have asked us the big question about why is it this way, and we don't want to do this anymore, we saw our neighbors over there do it and we don't want to do it, tell us what else we can do. And that's when our work started to change, to really flip this whole paradigm on its head. And on the next page, page 26, you have the triangle upside down. And we're actually not going to spend much time on that right now, just to say that our communities, having gone through this, and us having experienced this time and time again with communities, determined that we could no longer do this, or there's no point in us doing this because the bad thing comes in. The environment gets affected, the economy gets affected, whatever it is. And so we're going to be talking about tomorrow how we turned, in essence, the triangle upside down, changed our work, recognizing this system doesn't work, something else needs to happen. And we're going to look at what that means for communities and what we're doing with them to turn that system upside down such that they are able to address this broad problem statement instead of the state. And thus they get to determine what happens in their communities. Any questions on this before we move on? Okay.
A phrase you're going to hear often from me is this one, which is, and it's even worse than that in some ways, because the fact is, you know, we're shooted down to this place to deal just with manure within this regulatory framework. The default to that, of course, is that we can't deal with any of these things from a legislative level at the local community level because of those preemption clauses. So it's actually a double-edged sword. It's not only shooting us down saying you shall only talk about one issue down here, it's also on the flip side saying you shall not legislatively do anything in your community that actually gives birth to any of these real concerns having an impact on what happens within the community itself. And the second piece where it gets worse is that occasionally something breaks through. A community group will rise up, they'll find some kind of hole, some kind of loophole in the Nutrient Management Act, for example. They'll find something to grab onto, and they'll get a victory, or what you can actually say is a victory. They'll stop something temporarily, they'll delay it, whatever. And that victory, one of the people in the classes that we had before called it random positive reinforcement. In that victory, the community that goes through that victory then becomes the success story that attempts to replicate it in other places. And so even though it's, you know, the 0.001% or whatever, and a success rate, that actually happens. This has a life of its own because it gets replicated to other communities to say, don't give up on the regulatory system. It actually worked for us. We did it.
Meanwhile, the regulatory system is
Can you repeat the what?
Correct.
What is it?
Yeah.
Random what?
Random positive reinforcement, I think was the phrase. So, in addition to that, in addition to the fact that this then replicates itself like a virus, because then other communities get sucked in to say, we can win it too, we can do it, and we'll just have to do it better, and we'll have to hire the lawyer that group found. And it cycles the dependence, is that foundations, other folks that give money out, the foundations actually fund those folks to write books and to write studies, and all that stuff then goes out into the ethosphere. And it actually begins to replicate itself, this cycle of dependence on the regulatory system. It's very, very powerful. And as a note on the groups, you know, Amari said, of course, it's not just us. When we say us, we mean the environmental groups doing this work. It's very difficult, almost impossible, to have conversations with these folks. Any lengthy, in-depth conversations. It's very difficult. I have friends in all the major environmental groups, you know, NRDC and the Sierra Club. A lot of them privately, you know, this is good stuff you're doing, Lindsey, but we'll never do it kind of thing. It's very tough because there are careers built on this. There are careers built on this. You'll find large law firms, huge law firms, international law firms, with environmental lawyers who litigate only Section 301A2I of the Clean Water Act. That's their life. They don't do MPDS, they don't do total maximum daily load. They do 301, 2, little a, little I, little 2, whatever. And that's their life. That's the only litigation they do. They've built a career out of this. And one of the things we're going to be talking about later in the democracy school is this concept of rights of nature, that nature is property under our system of law. And we got to do something about that because it's a problem. We went around the United States a couple years ago in a tour to talk to environmental lawyers, to talk at law schools and to talk at colleges. And we would get to talking about this stuff. And when we were about 15 minutes into the talk, the environmental law professors would get up and walk out of the auditorium. right? And that may not make too much sense to us at this point of the democracy school curriculum, but it's certainly going to make sense to us tomorrow because there are people invested in this. There are literally hundreds of millions of dollars that get shoveled into this process every year. And there are places where it gets reinforced. This is the glue that holds the shit together in a very dependent cycle within the United States. I had to learn the hard way because the Sierra Club and the major environmental groups in Pennsylvania came to us privately to urge us to stop doing the work that we were doing in Pennsylvania. Because they said, if you actually liberate community self-government to build new Bill of Rights structures that actually prohibit corporate farming, it's going to lose, number one, and number two, you're going to piss off all the legislators and they're going to take away our regulatory window. They're going to take away our regulatory options, right? And we don't usually cover that tonight, but we have a fairly advanced crew here, is to say that that was one of our awakenings. The groups that we thought would be allies, because we thought we had found a more efficient way, a more effective way, something built on some core values that people in Republican conservative areas had that overlapped with other political jurisdictions, that they would be interested in helping. And they have not. And they have not because their brains are in a weird, different place. And secondly, they make a living from this stuff, right? Right? And so later in the curriculum, we're going to talk about who's actually moving this work. It's not longtime activists. It's not progressives. It's not liberals. It's first-time activists who are coming to this stuff. People that probably wouldn't want to be identified as activists, as that term is used. Who's actually doing the work. It's not the long-time liberal progressive groups. We found them to be a problem. We found them to be an obstacle. And in some places, they're more of an obstacle than the actual corporations that the community is attempting to fight. And that may sound like strong language, but it's where we're at. It's like the city of Pittsburgh. The city council we are working with as a municipal client, who for the first time a major municipality bringing up an ordinance that strips natural gas corporations of constitutional rights in the municipality, and the largest environmental groups in Pennsylvania got together to send a coordinated letter to the city council saying, you can't do it.
Really?
It's illegal and unconstitutional and you can't do it and you're going to get sued and we don't support it. Right? So we're to this really weird place. Well, it's about building a new constituency of people that can actually see what's happening and take action commensurate with that site. And these groups, unfortunately, have been a problem. Now, the deal is we get people from some of those groups who come to us who say, I've been doing this for 30 years, running around this for 30 years. I thought I'd be further along 30 years from when I started, and I want to do work with you guys. People that have come to us and said that, and they bring real skills and resources and everything else. But by and large, these institutions have been a problem with this work. So I just want to be clear about that from the beginning.
Name the pocketbook, that's where it really comes to money.
Possibly, but I think it's deeper than that. I think that's too easy an answer. It's actually, a lot of them think this works, or thinks that that's all there is. And part of this is talking about whether there are other options than that. David, and then we got to move on. But if you think about it, we censor ourselves. When we have the big environmental conferences, we take the timber folks and we put them over here. We take the water folks who put them over here. We take the agribusiness folks who put them over here. In other words, even when we have our own conferences, we tend to treat them as single issues in little stalls. And then we have our cliques about how to deal with them. This is about, the problem is not the individual single issue. There's a bigger structural problem, which is we don't decide what happens in our own communities. It's a democracy issue. It's not an odor pollution, timber clear cutting. It's not those issues. It's about the structure itself that we're stuck in. And this itself, this regulatory system, is about regulating us. It's about regulating what we do and how we come at these problems. And it just so happens the boys have written a script for us. And there's an even bigger script than this, which we're going to get to tomorrow, which deals with corporate rights and preemption and all this other stuff that's 140 years old. The regulatory system goes back a long ways too, but this is just the first level of stuff that you run into. There's 5 or 6 underneath. It's like an iceberg where you see, 10% on top and 90% underneath, and this is about figuring out that underneath. No, but because it's not only un-American but illegal to move outside of this process. In other words, we know where the process goes. It's the bolt that you get in your head at the bottom. We know where that goes. We've had enough experience with that. The question is, so what? So what that the system operates like this? What else is there? And that's part of what the democracy schools are about, is getting to that place. But the so what and what is there means doing what the abolitionists and the suffragists and prior people's movements have done, which is massive disobedience to the existing structure of law. There's going to be 1,000 lawsuits. There's going to be 10,000 lawsuits by the time this is done, because the institutions, including the courts, are not going to help this thing build. When people move outside of this, they're going to punish that process. And so if we know that, how do we incorporate that into the organizing to actually build it instead of have it fall apart? Because today when we go into court and the judge rules against us, the community group dissolves and we go away. The question is, how do you capture that residue so that a loss in the courts actually energizes and accelerates the organizing to happen rather than shut it down? And that's the advanced place we're going to be tomorrow afternoon when we actually take a look at the organizing. And along with that, there are some people that come through. I mean, we followed the Vashon Island stuff pretty carefully a number of years ago. Adam Sachs was one of the context people and all this stuff. But some of these people actually, you do win. You know, you find a zoning mechanism or something, you get lucky, and you come through and you actually do have the victory. But at that point, some of these folks come to an understanding that, my God, we had to put our lives on hold for 8 years or 10 years to actually fight this thing. And the next corporation that wants to come in, the structure is not any easier for us at the next time. You see, when the corporate boys win something, they actually win something structural, so the next time they need to do something, it's easier to do. Us, we fight within the structure. If we win, it doesn't change the structure at all. So if one year it's Walmart and the next year it's Smithfield Foods Corporation coming in, Smithfield Foods Corporation stands in the shoes of Walmart. So even though you would chuck Walmart out after 10 years and spending $200,000 for the lawyers, that the next round you got to put your life on hold and fight 8 to 10 years again. Once again, there's no guarantee that you're going to get anything done within this process. So moving on, it's not just the environmental arena that this regulatory process operates. It's also the labor arena. Yeah. And the next piece that you have is on page 30. I'm not going to go through the piece except to say two things about it. It talks about free speech in the workplace. One of the things that folks sometimes don't realize about constitutional rights in the workplace is when you go to work in a private workplace, a private employer workplace, you give up your constitutional rights when you walk through the door. You have no First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, 14th Amendment rights in the workplace. And generally the principle that we're going to explore in detail tomorrow is something called the state actor doctrine. It's a fairly complicated piece of law, but to simplify it down, was after the abolitionists drove the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments into the Constitution, and African Americans were protected in the South from discrimination, not just by government, but also by the KKK and the other organizations that were ranging across the South, that the courts, in an effort to take protection away from African Americans in the South, declared that the 14th Amendment could only be used to stop official or governmental discrimination, but not discrimination by private groups in the South, like the KKK, for example. And just to show you how egregious that was, even though we're going to teach it tomorrow, is that in the South you had African Americans being lynched, and then family members bringing suit to recover damages for violations of the civil rights of the individual that got lynched. You'd have sheriffs in southern counties who would actually take their badge off, put it on the desk, and walk outside and help with the lynching. And then the family would attempt to sue the sheriff, saying that you violated the constitutional rights of the individual that's been lynched, my family member. The courts, in an effort to dial back the 14th Amendment to take those protections away from African Americans, invented something called the state actor doctrine, which said that when the sheriff took his badge off, he was no longer acting as a governmental official and therefore couldn't be held liable for the lynching or violating the civil rights of the African American, even though the 14th Amendment was originally intended to protect against private acts as well as public acts.
Same name.
Right. Why does that affect this? Well, it affects this because corporations are private actors under the law. They actually grab that body of case law that was developed right after the Civil War and use it to protect themselves from lawsuits by you for corporate violations of your constitutional and civil rights. So for example, if Jeff, maybe he's prone to do this, I don't know, but he goes out on the sidewalk, public sidewalk, on a soapbox and starts giving a speech, I come along as a private individual, not government, not a police officer, not anything else, and I stand next to him with a bullhorn, and I actually drown him out by giving a speech of my own. You would think that my actions would violate Jeff's First Amendment constitutional rights, but they don't. Because Jeff can't bring a constitutional lawsuit against me for violating his First Amendment rights because I'm not government. And the Bill of Rights protects you from governmental action. That's what the Bill of Rights is all about. So Jeff would not have a constitutional cause of action against me. The reason why it's relevant here is that when a corporation, like an agribusiness corporation, wants to put in a 15,000 head hog factory farm next to your house, we get calls from people who say, well, wait a minute, that factory farm corporation moves in and I lose 50% of my property value. The corporation has taken my property value and therefore they violated my Fifth Amendment rights, which says my property can't be taken without just compensation. To which we look back at them and say, au contraire, because corporations are private actors, they can violate your constitutional rights at will. Okay? They can violate your constitutional rights at will, and you have no constitutional remedy against them. When we talk about private workplaces, we're talking about private employers being private actors, not state actors, and they can deprive you of your constitutional rights in a private workplace. So when you cross the threshold, you lose your constitutional rights when you walk into that private threshold, that private work threshold. In addition to that, losing your constitutional rights, there's also something called captive audience meetings, which labor unions are very familiar with. But it's private employers that can actually mandate your attendance at non-work related meetings in the workplace with the threat of repercussions if you do not attend, firings or being threatened or reprimanded in other ways. You have no constitutional rights in the workplace, which means that private employers can subject you to that kind of control. In essence, if you disagree with that kind of control, because that is the structure of law that's in place in the United States, you're shooted into a regulatory appeals process through the NLRB or through another labor regulatory administrative entity, and that structure looks almost identical to this one. In essence, it's about putting the structure of law in place as the DNA and then giving us very limited remedies through that structure of law to actually appeal, make grievances, those types of things over those types of issues. So once again, mega structure of law and then a regulatory process in which you have a very thin and very small spectrum of remedies that you can actually pursue through that regulatory process. In the back.
By what authority does the government prohibit discrimination in the workplace?
Discrimination laws actually come in under the Commerce Clause to the Constitution. And so we'll talk more about that. But in the name of commerce, there have been certain things put forward by congressional authority that say that certain types of discrimination can occur in the workplace, but it's done under the authority of the Commerce Clause. It's not a rights-based issue, but we'll talk about more about that tomorrow. Okay.
What was the name of the law that rendered the Bill of Rights not applicable to private?
It's called the State Actor Doctrine, and it's actually a purely judicial doctrine. It's a court-concocted legal doctrine. And we're throwing a lot at you tonight. We're going to peel a lot of this stuff back over the course of tomorrow. This is just to give you an overview of where we're headed.
I just want to point out that the protest happening in Madison, Wisconsin right now is about exactly this, I think.
Yes.
What you're saying.
Well, it's about collective bargaining not being a right that can't be removed. And so the structure of law does not see collective bargaining as a constitutionally embedded right, and therefore it can be removed at the will of the legislature. So that's part of what's happening in Wisconsin today. So the next piece Mari's going to take us through, and it's on page 34. A lot of people think that the regulatory agencies were actually set up to protect health, safety, and welfare. And in essence, the regulatory agencies in the United States have a much different pedigree. So we're going to spend a minute on page 34.
This is a piece from a book called Fear at Work by Richard Kazis and Richard Grossman. And just to say that the regulatory system isn't anything new. We've looked at environmental, we've looked at labor a bit, and now we're going to look at where it all began. Page 34, we'll read through this. It was largely at the insistence of the major railroad companies that Congress created the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1887. As the first federal agency with the power to set prices and place conditions on entree into the industry. The railroads wanted to stabilize prices in their young and expanding industry and to prevent companies from destroying one another. From the industry's perspective, the good thing about the ICC was that it stabilized prices and profits without challenging corporate power. As U.S. Attorney General Richard Olney assured the president of Burlington Railroad in 1893, quote, "The commission is or can be made of great help to the railroads. It satisfied the popular clamor for a government supervision of the railroads at the same time that that supervision is almost entirely nominal." Further, the older such a commission gets to be, the more inclined it will be to take the business and railroad side of things. It thus becomes a sort of barrier between the railroad corporations and the people, and a sort of protection against hasty and crude legislation hostile to railroad interests. That is our first regulatory agency. Environmental and labor regulatory law seems to work the same way. You know, we've talked a lot about regulatory frameworks of law tonight, environmental, labor, railroad. And the question then becomes, what is law anyway? And in the next piece, we're going to look at how law is actually defined.
So we only have a couple more pieces before we let you guys go for tonight. The definition of law on page 36 is intended to dispel the myth that law has anything to do with justice. Sometimes we use those words interchangeably. When we think law, we think justice, and justice, we think law. There's folks that still think in that track. Page 36, we pulled out the definition of law from something called the Cyclopedic Law Dictionary, which is a law dictionary that merges together different legal definitions from different jurisdictions. You'll see on page 36 in that second paragraph down how they describe the law. It reads, and this is in that actually third paragraph down, third phrase, "It is the aggregate of those rules and principles enforced and sanctioned by the governing power in a community." Okay? So note the phrase, the sanctioned by the governing power in a community. And the people are not necessarily the governing power of the community, but it's the rules enforced and sanctioned by that governing power. So that's the definition of law from one of the law books that we found over the years. The real question in all of this, and the next couple pieces give a primer into tomorrow's, where we're going to start tomorrow, is where did all this stuff come from? Why do we have this structure? Why is law defined that way? It seems not to be connected to justice in many senses. And why are we in a position where our language and our culture seems to be predetermined by others? In other words, why do a certain number of people have control? And perhaps more specifically, why does it seem that a minority of corporate decision makers has more power than community majorities to actually decide what direction communities move?